Namaste, everyone. Thank you all for joining our sixth webinar, part of our Northeast Hindu Yuva Hinduism in the 21st Century webinar series. My name is Tanmay Vadipati, and I'm the co-coordinator for the series and a rising junior at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. I am also the vice president of UMass Hindu Yuva. Hindu Yuva is a student-run, nonprofit socio-cultural organization with a presence in over 35 universities and cities in the United States. Our aim is to practice, promote, and preserve our Hindu identity while growing up in the United States. Before I introduce our topic and moderator for this evening, I want to thank you all for watching last week's webinar about the Divine Shakti, which had over 1,500 viewers within the last 7 days. Throughout tonight's event, viewers watching live on YouTube and Facebook are more than welcome to comment questions they have about the topic, and we will be choosing unique questions for our moderator to ask the speaker. Also, just as a disclaimer, Hindu Yuva does not condone any sort of political discussion, so tonight's discussion is not reflective of Hindu Yuva or the political views of the speaker. Without further ado, our topic for tonight is Hindu social thought, decoloniality, and the global rights movement, being moderated by Chetan Hebar. Chetan ji is currently a technology professional working in New York City. He graduated from the University of California, Los Angeles, and majored in chemical engineering. He is very involved in the Hindu Yuva chapter based in Manhattan. Chetan ji is interested in learning more about the socioeconomic practices in India as well as the rest of the world. Thank you, Chetan ji, for being our moderator for tonight.
Thank you, Tanmay. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Sai Deepak. Sai is an engineer turned law firm partner turned arguing counsel, practicing as a lawyer in India. He graduated with a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering before moving on to get his bachelor's degree in law from IIT Kharagpur. He is engaged by soliciting law firms and individual solicitors to appear before the Supreme Court of India, the Delhi High Court, the Madras High Court, as well as other institutions in India. He focuses on civil commercial litigation, IP litigation, IT law, as well as other areas of law as well. He has clients across the pharmaceutical industry, e-commerce, as well as telecom. In July 2018, Saiji's arguments before Constitution Bench of the Supreme Court on behalf of the Ready-to-Wait women campaigners in the Sabarimala Ayyappa Temple Petition were covered nationally. He's also been involved in the Padmanabha Swamy Temple case and serves as mentor for organizations like People for Dharma, Upword and Indic Collective. And with that, it's my pleasure to welcome Saiji. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today.
It's my pleasure to participate in this session, and I hope to answer as many questions as possible to the extent I can. Please go ahead.
So first, to start us off, maybe a bit more about yourself. So, you got a bachelor's degree in engineering followed by a law degree. What made you go from sort of one area of practice to an entirely different one after studying engineering?
So I actually wanted to specialize in aerospace engineering. In fact, like most other Indians, I wanted to do a master's in aerospace engineering in perhaps a university in America. In fact, Georgia Tech was one of the institutions that I had applied for. But around the 5th to the 6th semester of my undergraduation, I think India was going through a polarizing experience in terms of the political atmosphere on campuses. And certain points of view had become politically incorrect. And for all practices, holding their opinion and airing or expressing the particular opinion invited a fair degree of isolation and ostracization, so to speak. And I was of the view that perhaps such a position or a worldview needed better representation or articulation. And it's always easy to hold opinions, but it's important to even train yourself in a certain area to understand whether your opinions are informed, do they have the requisite depth or not. And that's one reason that I decided to acquire perhaps a formal degree, so to speak, in at least one area of humanities. And given that I was interested in logic, reason, and argumentation, and I also wanted to understand the architecture of the Indian, let's say, political scenario, so to speak, and I wanted to understand the legal architecture because that seemed to be effectively the prism through which India's discussions were being held, because the constitution effectively had become a battleground, so to speak. And I had a point in commenting on the constitution without actually acquiring a formal degree, which allowed me to speak on that particular subject with a degree of intelligence and with a degree of training. And that's the reason that I decided to make that switch. But I suspect that a switch from engineering to law is not particularly uncommon in a country like the United States. From whatever I have heard of it, a JD is fairly a common switch from engineering. And in fact, I've seen a lot of people with advanced tertiary degrees, even with PhDs, make the switch to JD at some point. So fortunately, by the time I decided to make that switch, a lot of people were already considering it. So I can perhaps say that in my generation, gradually law started taking the position of, let's say, an MBA degree as well. And it was one of the basket of, let's say, one of the options available on the table for people who wanted to pursue a career outside of the engineering domain. So that's one of the reasons that I made that switch. Coupled with the fact that since the constitution was the battleground, it's always easy to comment on the constitution perhaps as a social document. But if you really want to come out with very specific, sharp inputs, it's important to have a legal degree and also specialize in the particular subject. Because unfortunately, constitutional discussions, I've seen this even in discussions in the United States, tend to get mired in opinions and socio-economic and political-economic opinions, as opposed to understanding the history of the particular document. So there is very little information about the document's history as such, and what is known as the original intent. And very few people outside of the legal domain are in a position to comment on these issues. So I wanted to understand the schema, the underlying, let's call it the neural network of that particular document, and go back to its basics. Because then when I speak about it, I'd be speaking from a position of confidence and scholarship. That would make me more impactful when I contribute to social discourses. And that's precisely why I made that switch.
Great. So coming out of law, how did you end up sort of arriving at maybe the higher profile work that you do now? Was it sort of a conscious decision on your part after graduating from law school, sort of to find yourself work that will sort of have great social impact? Was that journey for you easy?
So while there was always the intention to have a greater social impact, so there is this breed of lawyering known as the pro bono lawyering or the public interest litigation lawyering. Now, that breed exists in jurisdictions like, let's say, the United States, United Kingdom, as well as in India. But you see, I wanted to understand the process of acquiring the proficiency of a trial litigator in the first place. Because what you acquire in the process of being a trial litigator are the forensic skills when it comes to reading a certain document and putting aside your own biases or prejudices or proclivities on the side and focusing on what is it that the facts tell you in the first place. Okay. So an evidence-based approach comes very naturally to someone who is trained excessively or extensively in trial law. Okay. So from there, when you keep moving up to appellate law and then finally constitutional law, two things happen. One, constitutional law is generally seen as a subject that requires people to have a flight of imagination at perhaps a stratospheric level of 60,000 feet. Okay. But in the process, what happens is that the finer detail, it gets lost. Okay. And the devil lies in the detail in law, whichever branch of law you speak of, whichever area of practice you speak of. So frankly speaking, I wanted to bring the forensic skills of a trial litigator and a commercial litigator to the area of constitution, because then you combine practical forensic application with your ability to ideate and imagine at a certain level. Because constitutional law certainly involves a fair amount of creativity and the canvas is broad. It's fairly wide. And you cannot limit yourself to just the legal issues. You have to look at social impact. But your discussions relating to social impact of a constitutional provision are even better when you have the forensic approach of a trial litigator. So that's why I spent the first 7 years focusing extensively on acquiring skills of a trial litigator in various areas of law, of course, related areas of law. And that coupled with the fact that constitutional law as an area of practice doesn't necessarily pay in the first few years. Okay. So for you to actually pay your bills, I think it's important to have an area of practice that pays. and then continue to work on and build your depth and skills on the side as far as constitution is concerned. And once you acquire a certain stature or a position as someone who knows what he's talking about and who knows the subject, and because the one thing that trial law certainly teaches you is to understand what is it that you're not supposed to speak on more than what you're supposed to speak on. Because when you start training witnesses for a cross-examination, that's more or less what you do. So a degree of circumspection, skepticism, and respect for facts and evidence is something that you cannot abandon even when you speak of constitutional law. So for the first 7 years when I was working as part of a law firm, and when I quit as a partner of that law firm in 2016 and set up independent practice, I was in a much better position to take up causes and areas of practice than I was perhaps when I was working as part of an entity. Because you see, when you decide to have opinions, especially with respect to constitutional law, it's inevitable that some of your opinions are even political in nature. And when you operate as a partner or a fairly well-known representative of an outfit, your opinions get associated with the entire outfit. And I don't think any other organization must pay the price or the consequence of a certain opinion that you hold, unless, of course, the organization itself believes in the particular opinion. And it would have been unfair on my part to saddle my opinions or impose my opinions on the rest of the organization. So going independent and setting up practice as an arguing counsel gave me the freedom, the liberty, and the autonomy to take positions and also act on those positions by actively taking up cases which advance those positions.
Yeah, that's fantastic to hear. So maybe just adjacent to sort of, maybe law, and maybe it's not so adjacent, but maybe sort of two sides of the same coin, is the topic for today's discussion. So decoloniality, the global rights movement. For folks that may not be aware of maybe the other things that you have written about the subject, could you perhaps go into a bit of a brief overview of what decoloniality means and mean to us?
So let me share with the listeners, so to speak, my own experience as to how I stumbled upon this particular topic. So you see, for the longest of time, the Constitution and discussions revolving around the Constitution, particularly in the context of, let's say, indigenous practices, or practices which are seen as native to traditions and faith systems which are native to India, they've always been pitted in adversarial modes. Okay. The impression that has been given to most people of my generation and even the successive generation is that the Constitution is a book of reform. Okay. And that certain parts of the society, or especially native traditions, are in the need for reform. Okay. So the Constitution was seen as the instrumentality of effecting that particular reform. And in the process, what it has done is that it has severely deracinated, so to speak, or at least undermined the nexus between people and their roots to a great extent. Okay. And the question that a lot of people started asking was whether this was the original intent of the Constitution or the framers of the Constitution. And in the context of the Indian Constitution, the one clarification that I think is very important is that we don't use the phrase founding fathers at all. Because one, it was contributed to by both men and women, or women and men, whichever order you wish to use it. And in fact, women played a significant role in engrafting and crafting of the progressive provisions of the Constitution, especially its reformative provisions. Okay, so the question that people started asking was whether the Constitution was being used as a tool to colonialize or to apply certain alien standards to native traditions. Okay, which is to say, if you start approaching native traditions and indigenous ways of life through a certain prism which is completely alien to them and which has absolutely no basis or anchor in the native worldview, then what you do is that you approach it from some, if not prejudice, you at least have preconceived notions. And those preconceived notions always inevitably lead to an outcome where the civilizational root of a particular tradition is seen as unconstitutional. Okay, and this has a bearing not just on the way people see themselves from an internal perspective, but also the way the world sees that particular community. Okay, imagine any native tradition being branded as either superstitious or savage or, let's say, outdated by the highest court of the land, That is precisely the prism which perhaps a New York Times or a Washington Post or any other, let's say, popular outlet is going to look at that particular practice, because their sole point of reference happens to be the judgment of the highest court of the land. Okay. So increasingly, there was, I think, an interventionist approach of the judiciary with respect to native practices. And when the judiciary starts taking that particular position, an unelected part of the state, an organ of the state, is effectively taking a position with respect to native practices or practices which are indigenous. Let's use the word indigenous as opposed to native. Okay. So what is it that decoloniality does? This framework of decoloniality effectively asks different members of the state, or let's say the stakeholders of the state, to reorient their compass and understand the practices for what they are, and to keep their colonial lens aside for a moment. Okay. And to try and relate to the practice from the standpoint of the practitioners themselves and standpoint of those who are direct stakeholders to the particular practice. But why do I use the word colonial lens? So you see, for all practical purposes, a society like India is a post-colonial society, especially after its independence in August 1947. Okay, so across the world, several countries which have which are effectively post-colonial societies have had to go through an identity flux. They've had to go through a serious phase of transition. The one thing that they've tried to do is they've had to take a decision: should we continue the practice of the institutions which we have inherited from the colonial master or the colonizer, so to speak? Or do we try and create our own institutions? And if you're supposed to create our own institutions, where do we draw the idea for such institutions? Do we have any native thought to establish such an institution? So for a moment, let's assume that today a constitutional democracy or a parliamentary form of democracy is more or less seen as the norm across the world. Okay. Assume for a moment that a post-colonial society wanted to do away with that particular structure and build on political thought which it has inherited from its own civilization. What kind of a thought would it fall back on? Okay. So decoloniality is effectively saying, I want to reclaim my identity at the most tangible level possible, which also means that the institutions of governance which run my country are also based on political thought which has emanated from this land and which has originated from this particular land. Because then those institutions are in a much better position to frame policies which are consistent with the spirit of my culture and my civilization. The basic point being to argue that one standard has to be applied across the world, across all societies and across all civilizations, is fundamentally a standard which is monochromatic in nature, which pits itself against this buzzword of diversity. Because you can't speak of diversity on the one hand and then speak of a uniform standardized approach to concepts such as human rights, justice, governance, and whatnot across the world. So the very tendency to export one point of view and one form of governance and one form of administration to multiple societies and different societies is to do injustice to the political thought and social thought of those societies and those cultures. And especially a culture and a civilization such as India, which at the very least has, let's say, a recorded history of 5,000 to 6,000 years, is in a much better position to draw from the repository and reservoir of its own political thought to give effect to its institutions. Okay. So assume for a moment that today you've chosen to have institutions which seem Anglo-Saxon in nature, like a parliament, a democracy, or an election, so on and so forth. It is still the skeletal structure. It is possible to use the skeletal structure that you may have inherited along with values and definitions which you draw from your own traditions. So what is justice? What is equality? What amounts to human rights? And what forms part of this bundle of human rights? India can still draw from its own institutions, from its own traditions, from its diverse traditions and schools of thought, while retaining the skeletal structure which it has inherited from the British colonizers, so to speak. So the decoloniality as a movement has effectively its origins in Latin America. And there are several scholars, and one scholar who keeps coming up on and on when you discuss this particular issue is this Argentinian scholar by the name Walter de Mignolo, whose book on the theory as well as the practical applications of decoloniality is a must-read book according to me. I am still in the process of reading the book extensively. And there are several parts of the book which are brilliant. But you see, for the better part of this particular movement, the way it has evolved is it is not an analytical approach, it's not a conceptual framework. It is broadly evolved as a descriptive observation of how native cultures and indigenous societies have gone about resisting this move to impose, let's say, a Eurocentric approach or a Western-centric approach on their governance structures. Now, gradually what has happened is that this particular movement has found traction in other parts of the world, even outside of Latin America, where decoloniality has been going on for a very long time in their own ways and in its own different ways. But people have not had a conceptual framework to explain what has been going on. So, for instance, when Indians were making a case for independence when the Britishers were still around, the first question that the colonizers effectively asked Indians was, how do you think you can come out with the concept of an Indian state when the idea of India has never existed until we stepped up or when we showed up on your scene? Okay. So in fact, the question that the Britisher was asking so-called, let's say, Indian nationalists of that particular point of time was that India was never a nation and you've been cobbled together and you've been stitched together by the munificence of the British. So how can you claim independence for this entire region when you've never been a single political unit? Okay. So at that stage, I think Indians had already started talking back, and that's the important word, or that's the important phrase or the operative phase. They started talking back to the colonizer to reclaim their identity, to basically say, please don't apply your notions of nationhood or your notions of what a society is and your notions of political unity or civilization unity on us. We have existed as a civilization long before the idea of Britishness ever showed up on the historical scene. Okay. So while we may have not been a single political unit, we have been a single civilizational unit, which is shown from our epistemology, which is shown from the way people from different parts of this particular region can relate to each other because they belong to the same civilization, notwithstanding the different languages they speak, notwithstanding the different ways of life that they practice, notwithstanding the obvious differences in eating habits, in, let's say, cultures and customs. They effectively made the case that these are externalities which do not rise up to the level of denying the underlying civilizational unity. So, which is why if you look at one of the mottos of the modern Indian society, it continues to be unity, diversity, because the diversity that you see is the outward expression because of the longevity of this particular culture. So different aspects of this culture in different regions have had the opportunity to come out with their own individualistic identities. But at the end of the day, they meet and they originate from the same source, which is the Indian Bharatiya civilizational identity. So decoloniality is effectively a statement of resistance or a statement of taking your identity back to say, please do not assume that we do not have the skill sets or we do not have the traditions to draw from to define our own self as a society, and also to define our political institutions and the manner in which we organize ourselves as a functional society and as a functional civilized society. So which community or which particular culture is civilized cannot be dictated by one person sitting either in the United States or in the United Kingdom or some part of Europe. Every country has the right to decide what amounts to civilized behavior depending on its own history. That's the basic position that decoloniality puts forth.
Yeah, I think that's very, very interesting to hear. So you mentioned, so how do developing sort of a indigenous, maybe Indic perspective. What kind of documents? So you mentioned reference to some of these things. So what kind of experiences, documents, or sort of roots do we have to draw from? So if you were given the opportunity to maybe construct a new legal system in India, maybe where would you look for inspiration?
So it is commonly assumed that the concept of a consensual decision making or a participative political process is largely the export of the West. That's, or at least largely an export of Europe is the understanding. Because most people assume that Magna Carta is the be all and end all of the concept of rights, the concept of individual freedom. And most people assume that the concept of a nation state is effectively the gift of Europe to the rest of the world. Okay. But there is enough literature which shows that the concept of participative decision making, the concept of a state council, the concept of decentralized local administrative structures, the concept of democracy and confederacy, the concept of a federal structure, the concept of freedom of speech and expression, the concept of dissent, the concept of effectively deferring to certain institutions or nerve centers of learning when it comes to policy making for the rest of the society, where the king, for all practical purposes, is held accountable by intellectuals of a certain society. Each of these concepts are traceable to various traditions of various parts of India. Now, the good part about India, or at least the aspect of India which sets it apart from the rest of the world, is that for all practical purposes, since it has been a civilizational unit, it is not possible to look at one set of principles or one central book, and which I think is effectively the distinguishing feature or the USP of the faith systems of India as well as the political systems of India, as far as, let's say, its cultural organization, so to speak. Okay, so there is no one book, there is no one philosophy, there is no one organized central institution which can claim to be the source of everything. Okay, so if you go to different parts of the country, there are different philosophies, but largely, if you were to be a student of Indian philosophy, you're looking at 6 different schools of thought and 6 different schools of philosophy, and each of those philosophies have translated to multiple aspects. What are those multiple aspects? They have served as sources of law and jurisprudence. They've also served as sources of science for that particular matter, because you see, I mean, in popular culture, people are credited with the concept. I mean, Indians are credited with the invention of zero. That's more or less the popular assumption. What they don't seem to understand, what they don't seem to relate to, is that if you're in a position to discuss the concept of zero or nothingness, it has a lot to do with your spiritual thought and the way you perceive the universe and the way you perceive some kind of a supra-consciousness. Okay. So in fact, there's a brilliant branch of mathematics, which is a relatively evolving branch of mathematics, which is known as ethnomathematics, where what they also do is identify the impact of different cultures and their thought on the evolution of mathematics. Okay. So if zero is something that India has been able to conceive of and think of, it has not come out of nothingness. There is a certain societal thought and there is a certain school of philosophy that is responsible for triggering a thought in the direction of nothingness. Okay. So to come back to the basic point, there are 6 schools of philosophy, and these 6 schools of philosophy have then translated to multiple traditions. Okay. Multiple traditions to the extent that at some stage, religious traditions and administrative traditions have a significant amount of overlap and seem to draw from the same source. Okay. In fact, there are several recorded colonial records and books translated by the Britishers, so to speak, based on traditional sources and indigenous sources, which have reflected the fact and which have evidenced the fact that the concept of confederacy and the concept of democracy have existed long ago. So I'll give you an example from, let's say, what we think of history as far as Indian tradition is concerned. So this figure, which we know as the central figure of the Mahabharata, namely Sri Krishna, comes from the race of, or let's say this group of confederacies called the Vrishnis, okay, or the Shurasenis. That's effectively the let's say the race or the dynasty from which he is known to come from, he is associated with. Now, the important thing is the concept of kingship or monarchy was almost alien to that particular dynasty or that particular race, because they've always behaved in the manner of a confederacy. So at a time when monarchy was the norm and when you had kingdoms across the rest of India, this was one exception that stood out, where this particular entire group operated in the form of a confederacy, and decision making was based on consensus among elected leaders of different tribes or clans or groups. Okay, and to the extent that you would have a city council of elders and senior citizens or prominent citizens who would have the power of veto even over the power, or let's say even over decisions taken by the representative of that entire clan. Now, these are certain aspects which even the colonizer, so to speak, recorded as part of his translation of indigenous works. Now, coming to the concept of free speech, there is a brilliant scholar, a contemporary scholar, Sri Bharat Gupta, who is known for his expertise on Natya Shastra. Okay, Natya Shastra is traditionally associated with understanding certain forms of, let's say, dances or dance forms which have evolved. But the one thing that Natya Shastra is less known for, and it ought to have been known for better, is its expounding of the concept of free speech. Because it speaks of, let's say, what we believe is the Hindu divine pantheon. So if the Hindu conception of heaven has a central figure who goes by the name Indra, and Indra effectively decides to dedicate one particular hall or one particular place where anybody and everybody can perform and express himself or herself in as free a manner as possible. And that particular podium can also be used to criticize people, or including Indra. Imagine a person who dedicates a certain place which allows people to criticize the person who is responsible for the creation of that particular platform. Okay. So even in, let's say, our divine conception, so to speak, the concept of dissent, the concept of criticism, the concept of tolerating criticism and accepting criticism is known. And that's precisely why we don't believe in the concept of a messianic monologue where somebody holds a tablet from atop a mountain and then it's a top. It has always been dialogical. It has always been a question-answer based approach. So anyone who's read the Bhagavad Gita knows for a fact that Krishna was hounded for about 700 verses at the very least until Arjuna got his final answer. Okay. So the concept of debate and the concept of dialogue is something that the Indian society certainly does not need to learn from anybody else. Free speech, free expression, respect for individual freedom, and youth-based approach. These are central aspects of Indian culture, which distinguish it and which set it apart from what we have seen as part of the rights-based discourse of the West. I'll give you a simple example. The West is suddenly waking up to the fact that when you look at issues of environment and environmental jurisprudence, it's not sufficient to simply focus on rights, because at the end of the day, you're looking at transgenerational duty. And you have a duty to pass on at the very least what you have inherited from your ancestors, so to speak, because even if you're not able to create a better world for the next generation, kindly don't make it worse for them, is the current approach as far as environment is concerned. There can't be a better jurisprudence for environment than Indic jurisprudence and environmental jurisprudence, because capital punishment was awarded for felling of a tree, by the way. Okay. And the entire concept of Dharma is based on striking balance between individual avarice and greed and societal needs. So the sense of restraint and the sense of austerity in ensuring that consumerism doesn't drive individual aspirations is effectively what the concept of Dharma is all about. Which is to say that please realize that you're part of a larger unit. And when you're part of a larger unit, don't allow your greed to prevail over others' needs. These are aspects which India is in a much better position to contribute to when it comes to the global pool of thought, because environment is effectively a live issue, climate change is a live issue. So principles such as a duty-based approach, or principles such as the polluter pays, which is effectively one of the pillars of current environmental jurisprudence, these are aspects which India can legitimately claim to be the forerunner of. Okay, so when you come to environments, or for that matter, in fact, this is very important because I think this is a hot topic on American campuses, treatment of non-binary gender identities. Okay, this is perhaps one of the few societies which has never ever thought of persecuting anyone for their lack of a binary identity. Okay, and which has effectively believed in the concept of live and let live. That if you have a certain identity which you're comfortable with, and you don't wish to conform to, let's say, gender binary, so to speak, and you also wish to pray or celebrate the particular identity in a certain fashion, then you will be given that safe space. And the rest of the society will ensure that your right to practice your identity in that safe space is protected. It becomes the duty of the rest of the society. So worship of and celebration of non-binary gender identities is something that India has done for a very long time. There are deities who are non-binary in their gender, and there are practices and traditions which are non-binary in their gender, and who can have access to such spaces, and whether you're allowed even entry. So for instance, we speak of feminism and we speak of equal access and equal opportunity for genders across the board. The discussion with respect to non-binary gender identities was so advanced that even access to such spaces to women was prohibited, because that non-binary identity should not have to suffer any binary identity for that matter. It's not just the man, it's even the woman. That is the extent to which they had actually gone, to the extent of creating a layer for such discussions. So there's a lot that I think that Indian traditions have to offer, which are contemporary, which are relevant to every issue that the current society faces. I'm not saying that it's perfect, because one, I don't think any Indian tradition makes the claim that there is no scope for reform, and that everything that is possible and all perfection that is possible has already been achieved. In fact, we believe that the only constant is change, and the only way forward, or the only way ahead, is to move forward. Okay, so these aspects, according to me, make it perhaps the ideal open societal architecture, which is what slowly the rest of the world is moving towards, either in the realm of technology or in the realm of social engineering, so to speak. So that's why I think Indian traditions are extremely relevant. I understand this was a bit of a monologue, but I hope I've answered your question.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I think it's really great to hear. I also did not know about this sort of non-binary space that was afforded back in the day. So one thing that I'll note is, for all people that are listening right now, if you have any questions that you want to bring up, or any things that you want to ask Saiji, please submit them in either the Facebook or YouTube live feeds that you're viewing right now. And our team is collecting them, and we'll make sure to get those questions up in front of Saiji so he can answer them. So one question that so I think most of our viewers are, coming from the U.S. Many of them may have been born and brought up in the U.S. And sort of their knowledge of, Hinduism or India and its traditions may come through the lens of their own parents, and maybe the media that they consume outside of their own families. And I think in light of that, a part of the sort of political and sort of social storm going on in the U.S. has, come with it, has brought lots of awareness and education toward things like race in the U.S., which lots of people in my generation definitely are becoming more and more educated on. Along with that, I think there's also a great focus on sort of expanding your sort of view of society to those that aren't just in your country. For instance, lots of education going around sort of caste issues in India, or other kind of issues that may be going on.
Right.
How can we, as Indians, Hindus, anyone in the US, sort of take that decolonial sort of mentality to really understand what's going on? Or, how do we know how to process such information when, we're only getting it from maybe one side, or so one select group of sources?
Right. Since intellectual property happens to be one of my areas of practice here, I think I must attribute something. The better part of my discussions involving around decoloniality, and my thoughts have benefited from my interactions with this Hindu-American scholar, Srimati Indu Vishwanathan, who's based out of New York and who's an educator. And she has actually introduced me to some fantastic literature on this particular issue, which has allowed me to cross-pollinate, so to speak. So I've always been looking at indigenous points of view and giving indigenous epistemology a certain voice and a certain respectable position at the global table of thought and global pool of thought. So when I was looking for it, and when I was working on this already, I had the benefit of being introduced to the best of decoloniality literature by this particular individual. So I thought it was important to actually put it out so that I don't come across as having read everything on my own, which is never the case. It's always a collaborative process. You always learn from a lot of people. Now, as part of the discussions, in fact, I've even discussed with her the BLM movement, which is going on at this point in the US, its relevance to India. And the one thing that I realized is that the mistake that we make, both as Hindu Americans in the US and as Indians or Hindus in India, is that we try and map our respective worldviews and our respective thoughts on the other society. Okay, which is exactly the kind of tendency that decoloniality resists, and it says, don't do that. Okay, you understand a certain movement and you understand a certain reaction in the context of that particular place. Okay, and you try and do justice to it, because then you try and understand it in terms defined by the people or the stakeholders who are directly affected by it. Okay, so what would that mean? For us to approach the experience of the African American community from the standpoint of caste would be a case of, let's say, a reverse imposition. Okay, just as it would be equally unfair to approach issues relating to caste from the aspect of race from an African American perspective. Okay, because no two experiences are the same. So while some might focus on the consequence, what makes the most difference is the cause and not just the effect. Okay, because it is the cause that tells you what are the underlying triggers. And once you understand the cause, you're in a much better position to ideate with respect to the solution. Because you see, it's not enough to understand that a certain person suffers from a fever and the body temperature is just skyrocketing. You need to understand what has caused it, because not all forms of fever have the same kind of treatment. Okay, you need to know what is the root cause and what is the underlying issue. Okay, assuming that there is a certain instance of exclusion, you will have to ask yourself whether exclusion is the intended cause or is it the inadvertent effect. Okay, because if it is the intended cause and it is based on prejudice, you land up at the conclusion of discrimination directly. Okay, but if that particular exclusion has a certain reason, is limited by time, space, and other considerations, then that exclusion can either be selection or it can be for the purposes of finding the best possible outcome. So since exclusion itself has multiple layers, and one of the layers being discrimination, it translates to the simple position that not all forms of exclusion is discrimination. I'm just using this as an example to basically come out with a position that it would be utterly ahistoric and unscholarly to understand caste-related issues in India without understanding the underpinning triggers or understanding its history. As ahistoric and unscholarly it would be to understand to impose an Indian view on the African American experience. Okay, because you see, reservations are given on the basis of caste in India for a different reason, and affirmative action as employed in the US is very different for a different reason altogether. Okay, because the is based on clear racial differences and certain racial policies and race-driven policies. Okay, to use the concept of race and to use the concept or the prism of race or the lens of race for the Indian society or the indigenous society is to assume that it is composed of multiple races, which is unscientific, which has yet not been established by science. Okay, so the Aryan invasion theory, which is the popular reference point when it comes to caste-based discussions in India, people don't even know that the Aryan invasion theory was posited by a foreigner, by a colonizer, and by those people who believed in the colonizer's point of view. Now, what has happened and what is extremely unfortunate is that all scholarship that revolves around Indian society, especially around the issue of caste, it traces its origins to records and the understanding of the colonizer, who looked at the Indian society as a savage, barbaric society in the need for reform. And Rudyard Kipling, who is effectively known for his authorship of The Jungle Book, saw the Indian society as a white man's burden to bear and reform and civilize. Okay? Unfortunately, this very literature has become the reference point to understand caste-based issues in India. Okay? And decoloniality effectively says, even if caste is not an ideal system, not a perfect system, Is it fair to actually look at this particular system through the lens of the colonizer, who always had a vested interest in portraying this particular society as a barbaric society in the need of a civilizing, healing touch? Okay. So when the colonizer wants to justify every atrocity that he's committed on this particular society, he's going to create a justification on the basis of saying what this society was such a regressive, backward society, and it's a society which lacks morals, has no kind of moral anchor, and therefore my presence is the only thing that has effectively civilized them and shown them the light. Okay, so the Gospelian messianic approach of the colonizer is something that people must be aware of when they look at Indian history. Okay, so for instance, any example of, or let's say any allegation of patriarchy or misogyny with respect to the Indian society, frankly, would be fundamentally ahistoric for multiple reasons, because this civilization has seen a journey of at the very least 7,000 years, not 5,000 years, 7,000 years at the very least. Over a period of 7,000 years, is it possible to say that a society's approach has been entirely monolithic? It is bound to go through multiple phases. And when it goes through multiple phases, it is not entirely influenced by dynamics which happen within the particular society. When invasions take place, then the society reacts in a certain fashion. And the nature of invasion and the kind of interventions that take place in that particular society, the society responds in a certain fashion. Assume for a moment that a society is invaded by a particular group which believes that the women who are captured as part of, let's say, war booty, so to speak, must be treated as slaves, okay, and must be treated as inferior, subhuman creatures. Automatically, the society creates an, let's say, a response mechanism or a defense mechanism to protect that vulnerable aspect of their society, which is seen as war booty by the invading culture, so to speak. Okay, so these are certain aspects which I believe are extremely important, and that's why decoloniality in the Indian context is so relevant, because this is perhaps one of the few living civilizations which have continued with their unbroken traditions, and which constantly are, whose traditions are constantly looked at from the standpoint of, let's say, an Abrahamic practice or a Judeo-Abrahamic tradition. As unfair as it would be to look at a Judeo-Abrahamic religious practice or a societal tradition from the standpoint of a Hindu vantage point, it would be equally unfair to apply a Judeo-Abrahamic approach to a Hindu tradition or a Hindu way of life. Okay, so there are multiple ways of life. The concept of morality is fundamentally a diverse universe. Okay, so if one golden standard is employed as, let's say, the standard for global human rights, okay, to say that there is only one definition, there is only one yardstick, and there is only one metric, and all those metrics and benchmarks and yardsticks will be decided without participation of native societies or indigenous societies which have suffered colonialism, okay, then you continue to perpetuate the same colonizing mentality, because you're telling me that I don't have the same right as you to participate in a discussion on what is right and what is wrong on a question of ethics. Okay, so you continue to see me as a third world, regressive, backward, patriarchal, misogynistic society, which does not have the right to express itself when it comes to concepts of feminism, concepts of equality, and concepts of justice. This, I think, is something that Indians in India must learn, and Hindu Americans must also learn. Okay, because, and I think here's a slightly different aspect, and which Indu Vishwanathan was brilliant in pointing this out, and I completely agree with her. You see, I think when Indians go from India to countries like America or United Kingdom, they're looking for greener financial pastures, so to speak. Okay, and in the process, the better part of this particular community has acquired skill sets which are utilitarian in nature with very little contribution to the humanities. Okay, humanities do not feature in our list of, let's say, options, career options, either in India or in America. Okay, and that is the common aspect in both these societies. And the funny part is, professions such as teaching at any level don't really feature at the top of our career options. Okay, for a culture that worships the concept of guru, for a culture that worships the concept of teaching, for a culture which is
knowledge-based tradition which fundamentally respects epistemology, it is surprising that we have come to a point where teaching and teachers and taking up teaching profession as a vocation, as a choice of career, is almost at the fag end of anybody's career list, or let's say a list of options. Okay. Now, what does that translate to? It translates to the fact that you do not have anyone who can participate in production of knowledge. You do not have enough people who can participate in dissemination of knowledge from your perspective. So whatever you produce and whatever you consume and whatever you disseminate is produced by someone who doesn't share your point of view, who doesn't share your cultural position or your civilizational worldview. So you're always in the position of a supplicant and a recipient. This is the worst possible situation that the Indian civilization can be, because effectively you have said, I have nothing to contribute as far as production of knowledge is concerned, be it the conservative thought or the liberal thought, everything has to come from the West. I have nothing to contribute either to the conservative thought or the liberal thought. Okay. That way, concepts of social justice or concepts of capitalism, everything emanates from the West and the rest of the world is expected to consume it as a one-way street. Okay. So I believe that the one thing that Indians in America or Hindus in America can certainly start doing is to take an active interest in humanities, because unless and until you have qualification needed to comment on these particular subjects, to take it up as a part-time pastime hobby, so to speak, okay, will not give you the kind of respect that you think you deserve at the table when you discuss. From school curricula to representation of Hinduism in schools and in pop culture and in universities and discussions surrounding Indian society and Indian political developments, you will always be a supplicant because you do not have people who can speak from a position of qualification, conviction. Okay, this is, I think, what perhaps this generation of Hindu Americans can do, because perhaps your predecessors came there because with different set of priorities. They were looking at fending for their families. They were looking at conversion rates, saying $1 translates to 40 rupees or 70 rupees, and therefore I'm in a much better position to fend for my family back in India. With my qualification, I don't think India is in a position to give me opportunities, but America seems like it can. So those are more or less the kind of incentives which drove them to America. But the second generation Hindu American and the third generation Hindu American cannot fall back on the very same excuses, because frankly speaking, you are in a position of privilege for all practical purposes. And that gives you the ability to diversify beyond the traditional engineering, medicine streams and start looking at humanities as an option. Because when that happens, your voice will be heard. As long as that does not happen, you will only be a downstream consumer of what is being shoved down your throats.
Yeah, that's awesome. So I think we'll go to one of the submitted questions now, and I think this is also something that was on my mind, as you were speaking. So the question here says, so how do we know that looking back on the Indian history for sort of legal and sort of societal guidance or sort of inspiration,
right.
How do we know it will still be applicable, knowing that today's situation? But on top of that, so my own question that may be related to this, so maybe not be so related, is that how do we ensure that the folks who are in charge of making the laws or sort of molding the society and how our direction should go won't just put on sort of the mask or sort of the makeup of the Indic perspective and go back to the same kind of sort of practices, but just with a new coat of paint, as you will. So how do we know that these Indic traditions will be authentic in their approach and really effective and not just sort of a
right. So let me borrow from the one thing that I think Ms. Hindu Vishwanathan has said in no uncertain terms, and which I completely agree with, is that I don't think Indians, or especially Hindus, have paid enough attention to the fantastic advocacy of African American concerns by the African American community. Okay. We have done very little to invest in understanding how brilliantly they have advocated for their cause and how brilliantly they've managed to globalize that particular concern. Okay. So when protest marches are taken in either in Paris or in New Zealand for something that happens in one city in America to one particular community, I think it speaks volumes of their effort and commitment to their cause. Okay. So for a moment, even let's assume that someone disagrees with their position in entirety. For a moment, let's assume that is the case. Okay. Although it may be politically incorrect to take such a position in the current atmosphere, assume for a moment that is the case. You still have to give them credit for the manner in which they've organized themselves, the manner in which they've made themselves heard. And that particular lesson, unfortunately, for a smart community and a fundamentally intelligent community, Indian community, we don't seem to be drawing that lesson at all. We have not drawn that particular page from their book. Okay. So I'll give you two examples on this front. One is the African American experience, and the other experience, which the world perhaps is better aware of for reasons best known to the rest of the world, is the experience of the Jews. Name one, let's say, Jewish community in whichever part of the world they may reside in, which is not aware of the Holocaust experience and the persecution of the Jews and the lessons that the Jewish community has drawn based on that particular experience in order to protect its identity and to prevent, let's call it a repeat of history, so to speak. Okay. So there are two fantastic case studies before the Hindu community, whichever part of the world it resides in, which is to ask, what is it that they have done which has managed to convince the rest of the world of the legitimacy of their cause and the legitimacy of their identity, which we have failed to do. Okay. And that, I think, is a question of organization. And that, I think, is taking your identity seriously. Okay. Now, coming to your question specifically on sources, literature, and intent, and how do you prevent someone from taking you for a ride in the name of decoloniality? Okay. Look at the sad part of it. This entire discussion is happening in English. Okay. That is self-proof of coloniality to a significant extent. Okay. Why? Before you dismiss the application or the contemporary purchase or relevance of a certain concept, the question is, have you read the original literature in the original language without any kind of loss in translation or communication gap? Okay. Which means you try and read at least one school of philosophy in an Indian language and then ask yourself, are you in a position to apply it? Why? Science tells you that the language in which you read a certain thought makes a huge difference to your ability to read and relate to that particular thought. Cool. Okay. As long as you continue to read Indian thought in English as opposed to the language in which it was authored, you will constantly look at it, and you'll only look at it from the standpoint of an outsider. You're never inside the conversation. You're constantly an outsider. Okay. Now, what does this tell you? That coloniality has also resulted in the slow and excruciating death of languages. And language is not just a collection of words. It is the representation of culture. It is effectively a symbol of a civilization or a culture's journey. So coloniality, at a time when diversity seems to be the buzzword across the world, has resulted and is resulting in the continuing death of languages across the world and cultures across the world. Okay. So my answer to your question would be, first read from the primary source in the language in which that particular primary source has been authored. Then ask yourself whether this particular thought passes muster on the anvils of contemporary relevance. Okay. Until you read and until you're in a position to understand and relate to it, you're not in a position to dismiss it. And I don't think the default position can be to dismiss unless and until it is proven otherwise. The default position should be keep your mind open, look at that particular practice and look at that particular thought. Ask yourself whether it has the solutions to your current day problems. And only if you come to the informed conclusion that it is not in a position to, then you dismiss it. Now, coming to the question of not falling for somebody's charade of decoloniality, you can't call out someone's hypocrisy unless you're in a position to understand the practice in the first place, right? Again, it goes back to the very same thing. How do I know for a fact? So let me touch a raw nerve here and discuss the issue of caste from a different perspective. Okay. There are two schools of thought which are currently battling it out on the question of caste. Perhaps two schools of thought would be wrong. There are more schools of thought, but the two predominant schools of thought are, one says that caste was always birth-based, okay, and therefore it perpetuated a certain privileged societal structure, okay, and the other says, no, caste is not such a monolith because over a period of 5,000 years, it has been a fluid practice, and it has moved from a birth-based practice to a vocation-based practice. And it has also facilitated societal mobility, where it has been possible for people to choose different professions and accordingly choose different codes of conduct depending on the profession that they practice. Okay. Now, that is effectively the battle of ideas that is going on with respect to caste, broadly speaking. There is much more nuance to it. I'm just telling you what the summary of it is. Okay. Would you be ever in a position to contribute to this particular debate unless and until you've read the scripture in the language in which it was authored? Or you have read any sources in multiple languages in India where you get examples of how it was applied in practice in different regions, because then it's possible for you to arrive perhaps at a different nuanced conclusion that the idea of caste and the basis of caste was actually not uniform across the country or across the region. And different regions and different societies have taken to this particular concept in a different way. Therefore, a monolithic approach to the concept of caste to the entire country and a diverse society such as India is fundamentally doing injustice to both the concept and the diversity of the civilization. None of this is possible unless and until you equip yourself with knowledge from the primary source. So it goes back to keeping those sources alive. It goes back to keeping those, let's say, traditions of epistemology alive. And a tradition of epistemology can be kept alive only if the language in which that particular epistemology is taught is kept alive. So if you kill that entire language, and there is not a single person who can say that he's an expert in that particular language, who is in a position to understand how a certain word was used 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago. Imagine in English, which according to me is a hodgepodge of a language, the same word has different meanings in a span of about 50 to 70 years. It has acquired secondary significances. It has acquired multiple meanings. Okay. Something that was previously not considered pejorative has become pejorative. Okay. Something which perhaps never had a negative connotation has acquired a negative connotation. Given that, would you be in a position to understand what is the sense in which a word has been used unless you're able to relate the time-space, let's say, correlation of that particular word to say, this word was used at a certain point of time in the culture's history when this word had a certain connotation? How can you arrive at that particular conclusion unless and until you're comfortable with the history and the journey that that culture has traversed? You see how all of this is tied and how all of this is related. So a lot more scholarship and a lot more investment needs to go in each of these directions, in each of these topics, because it will tell you, one, whether all of this is merely an academic pursuit or whether or not it is contemporary relevance. Because you said nobody has the patience for academic pursuits today. People want to know, how is it going to make my life better? And how is it going to help me address current day problems? Okay. But if the current day problems are so serious and grave, then you might as well show that seriousness by investing in reading up that particular literature and disseminating that particular literature, because it can shatter myths, it can bust myths and preconceived notions. That is what I think decoloniality must effectively achieve, at least in the Indian context.
Yeah, I think, and one thing that I think really resonated with me is sort of you're mentioning that sort of the study of the Black experience, sort of the critical study of racism, and its sort of communication across, all countries has been sort of quite large, over the course. And I'm wondering, maybe it's, so Black Americans, at least, there is a certain sort of very real and very sort of hot fire, burning beneath, as it were. And I think my personal view is that this sort of provides like an internal imperative for young scholars, young people to sort of through their own personal conviction to say, I really want to study this because I want to make my community, uplifted and make sure that I'm doing the good work. But for Hindu Americans in the US, I think a lot of the questions that we're getting come to the back of the same kind of fundamental topic is how do we encourage, if that fire exists, how do we encourage ourselves to be aware that it's happening beneath our feet? And once we recognize that there is something to be done, how do we perhaps, as Americans growing up in the US, how do we find those opportunities or encourage those for others to sort of devote their lives or at least their professional careers toward this kind of goal?
So let's look at it from the basics, okay, from the fundamentals. I don't know, you watch The Big Bang Theory, I assume, right?
Yeah.
You've at some point you would have, right? So there is this particular discussion where I think Sheldon, Howard, and Leonard discuss how do we make science more appealing to women and girls, right? That's the discussion. And Sheldon says what? You discuss this issue from the standpoint of a tertiary degree or a graduation or undergraduation, but the problem is in schools, and they go back to schools. Okay. Now, here's a question to you as someone who I think is perhaps a second generation American, Hindu American. Okay. Okay. Because I think it's possible to make it out on the basis of accents. I'm assuming that perhaps you're a second generation American. So here's a question. Hindu Americans are fairly well off as a community, as a minority in America, right?
Mm-hmm.
How many Hindu schools have you actually come across in America? And how many schools have been established by the Hindu community to further the Hindu way of life? Forget camps, forget weekend camps or summer camps. I'm asking schools where there is a specific orientation. Just as you have Catholic schools and you have Jewish schools and you have schools which are set up by certain religious denominations, can you tell me that there are enough schools established by the Hindu American community to further their way of life?
I do not know of any accredited sort of primary school that has
Right. In your immediate circle, have you ever heard of someone attend such school? Ever?
Can you ask the question once more? Sorry, I think I might have broken up.
In your immediate circles, in your circles, have you heard of anyone who's attended such a school?
No.
There lies the problem. Okay. We don't even seem to have the initiative to set up schools. And here's the funny part, that the Hindu American community is more than happy to invite scholars from India on a regular basis, either for, let's say, Carnatic musicians or for kacheris and whatnot. They call everyone from across the world. Okay. But when it comes to creating homegrown talent and homegrown institutions, we still have not managed to establish a school or a schooling system or a Hindu curriculum, so to speak. Okay. Because from what I understand, these discussions in America are extremely decentralized. They happen at the local level. Okay. So you don't need to necessarily approach the federal government. You need to approach your municipality, your state government, and your immediate administrators, so to speak. So it's not as if the stakeholders and the decision makers and lawmakers are at such a distance that the tyranny of distance is something that you can blame as an excuse for not having done what you ought to have. Okay. So as I said, perhaps this was not a priority for the previous generation, but since the current generation is going to be, according to me, caught in the crossfire of identity politics, okay, and is going to be at the center of it and is going to experience it in their schools, on campuses, in pop culture, in every place possible, okay, I think now there is a burning incentive to, at the very least, start thinking of establishing schools and start training members of the Hindu community to become educators, because you obviously don't want people from India to come and teach you, and I'll tell you why. Assume for a moment that even Indians or Hindus from India come and teach you. They will not be in a position to equip you to meet the realities of the Hindu American life. That's very different. The kind of audience that you cater to, the kind of issues that you're faced with, the kind of identity related aspects that you're faced with, the kind of PC filters that you're expected to apply in your discussions, and the kind of conversations that you're expected to have, an Indian cannot relate to that, just as you can't claim to relate to everything that happens in India in its entirety. What you get is perhaps the worst medium possible today, which is mainstream media in any jurisdiction. Okay? Because the truth is truncated, and by the time it manages to reach any other jurisdiction, what you see is barely 10% or 5% of the entire picture. Okay? And the nature of news cycle is such that it barely remains relevant for a couple of hours. Okay? So therefore, you have to create your own, let's say, response mechanisms. And the first response mechanism is the establishment of Hindu education centers. And that doesn't mean some aunt or some uncle passing off as a part-time educator on a Sunday, or let's say on a festival day, or establishing summer camps. Long-term investment in hardcore fundamental institutions of education. This ultimately comes to a point where you will also have a role to play in production of knowledge, not just in dissemination of knowledge. Okay, both being very, very different, and the former being more fundamental than the latter. Okay, when you start doing that, that's when I think you will tell your own children that you can consider becoming a teacher. Okay, if the community doesn't show an interest in establishing educational institutions, any kind of pontification from a parent that please become a teacher, they'd say, then why don't you establish a school? Right? And temples in America are fairly flush with funds. Okay, and it is possible for schools to be established in the vicinity of temples, and that's precisely what we are fighting for in India, because the better part of Indian or Hindu temples are under state control. The temples of the Hindu American community are not in state control, and you can help us make our case better by establishing educational institutions in America which are run by temples, or at least have the guidance of temples, thereby giving us the template that we need to show here, saying that's precisely what is lacking in India as well. The concept of a Gurukula has gone completely out of fashion. Okay, so why? And I have heard of several Hindu American speakers speak about Gurukula in such glorious terms and extolling its virtues, but I'm yet to see a Gurukul except an online Gurukul, which is so ubiquitous and everybody wants to run an online Gurukul. Okay, that's not how it works. If you subscribe to that particular tradition, then please show your subscription and your conviction by living it and by practicing it. Otherwise, everything is just useless academic talk. It doesn't help anyone's case. You can't treat this as post-dinner pastime discussions. If you're serious about it, show it by actual investment.
Yeah, I think that's great food for thought. Do you know by chance if, I mean, so the one place that comes to mind is UK, where sort of Hindus have been living for multiple generations now, and they seem to have, at least from the American perspective, a bit more of a rooted, sort of self-sustaining community. Do you know if there's other models of sort of, I wouldn't call it Western schooling, but sort of like, you know, the sort of, because any school that you have to create has to fit a kind of Western mold in terms of the subjects you teach and how you teach them. Do you know if there are any such models out there?
I think ISKCON has managed to break that particular stereotype and has managed to establish schools, at least in certain parts of Europe, where from whatever I have seen and I've read, they have managed to show the world that it is possible to do things in a slightly different way. Okay, and that there is more than one form or one manner of pedagogy, so to speak, and there is more than one form of education. And I think the success of the Hindu society in UK lies in the fact that they've managed to mainstream Hindu education as part of even English education in several places. Okay, that tells me that they are doing something right, which perhaps we have not paid enough attention to. So there are examples of success and examples of initiative from within the community, which I think we can draw from. Okay, and this is subject to a deeper study of its chinks, but at the very least, there is something that is visible that meets the eye. Okay, because I don't think there is any system that's perfect, and so there's always room for reform. But they have taken steps which qualify for more than steps, which I don't think the Hindu American society has done. Okay, and which, while the Indian Hindu society wants to do, it is unable to because of the shackles of the state. Okay, so the one society which is perhaps extremely open-minded and which is affluent and which is in a position to call the shots, at least with respect to these issues, for some reason has not thought of it. It has never crossed their minds. And even if it has, perhaps this is a question of seriousness. Okay, if it matters to you, you would have done it. If it hasn't, at least you can't claim to cite paucity of resources. Nobody's going to buy that, right?
Yeah, that's definitely great food for thought. And we're coming up to the end of our time here. I think before we wrap it all up, do you have any sort of lasting thoughts, or maybe like a quick sort of thought you wanted to share with the viewers that are watching? I think we've touched on a lot of different topics here, and I think some may prove to be sort of very inspiring as we chew on them over the course of the next couple of days.
Right. So the one thing that I wanted to share, and this is perhaps slightly politically incorrect, but since free speech is a celebrated virtue in America, I might as well use it to the hilt and exploit it to the hilt. Okay. And I think the one thing that comes and which is a concomitant to the right of exercising free speech is the right to offend and shock. Okay. So I will use that particular right. There are parts of the Hindu-American experience which are very different from the Hindu-Indian experience. Okay, but there are certain parts which the future will effectively ensure that there is a significant amount of overlap, and I'll tell you why and how. So several members of my family, they fled India. I will use the word flee because they did not want to be bogged down by the caste-related discussions here, which figured hugely at their time because reservations was a huge topic of discussion. It continues to be a huge topic of discussion. And therefore, caste-related issues, they thought they can flee and avoid completely by going to a different jurisdiction altogether. Now, you can tell me and you can vouch for the fact that caste-related discussions have finally come to the American shores as well. Okay? And this conflation of caste and race under the umbrella of the critical race theory, okay, is something finally finding mainstream acceptance. Okay, so what they thought they could avoid and escape has finally come back to haunt them, even in the greenest of shores possible, in the greenest of pastures possible. Okay, so my general suggestion would be, the more you try to run away from a certain problem by being this globe-trotting, globe-hopping Indian who wants to run from one jurisdiction to another, hoping that this Voldemort will effectively run away from them and will effectively give them, it's not going to happen, because there's a larger battle of ideas that's going on, and it is inevitable that a significant number of issues which affect and infect Indian discussions will continue and will haunt you, perhaps if not in the next 5 years, in the next 10 years. Okay, so maybe it would help if the Hindu-American society got out of this mold of being a model minority and focused more on taking an active interest in how they are perceived by the people they live with, how the African American community perceives Hindus, okay, and what is their understanding of our issues. Whether you like it or not, you live in the age of narrative and packaging, okay, and nobody has the time or patience to dig deep and look at what the core says, because even if they realize that the core says something and what is being presented is something else, their voices will be snuffed or stifled completely, or they may not have the incentive to actually take on the rest of the ecosystem. Okay, so the only one who has a direct interest in protecting their way of life is the community itself, and the community can't express its seriousness better by actually investing in the long run, in the long term. Okay, I think the Hindu-American community must actively look at becoming participants in the political discourse, in the societal discourse, in public policy, in legal policy, in societal policy, and in education policy. Okay, the utilitarian approach of the Hindu-Americans to the American society, I think, should be a thing of the past. Okay, all of Maslow's basic needs have been satisfied. Now you please think of the next level. Okay, and the next level would be that you start producing legislators, that you start producing lawyers, that you start producing educators, that you start producing community organizers. Okay, and since there is at least a disincentive for lack of participation, that should translate to an incentive for participation. Okay, you have a negative incentive to take part because you thought you can stay out of all of this and focus on the greenback. The rest of the society and other dramatis personae will not give you that opportunity at all. They won't let you in peace. They won't let you live in peace as far as these issues are concerned. And if you think that Indians or Hindus from India are going to come to your rescue, that's not going to happen always. One, because they have their own issues to deal with. Okay, that's the sadder part, that despite being in India with a larger number at their disposal, they have a lot of issues to deal with. Most importantly, there is a question of a difference in experience. Okay, so there is a decent chance that the Hindu-American community can lead the way in telling us what is it that we can do differently here by showing us the path. Okay, if it is assumed that the Hindu-American community has the best of brains possible, which seems to be the standard assumption, then let the best of brains lead the way and show us the way by establishing institutions in the long run. That, I think, is my central message. Decoloniality, global human rights movement, all of this, according to me, is just one aspect of it. The central question is taking your identity back and not let anybody else define who you are and where you come from. Okay, that is the essence of decoloniality if I were to reduce it to the simplest of terms possible. And this is something that organizations like UA can actually build on and can galvanize the youth of the Hindu community and can have regular discussions and informed discussions. I think you would have started something that is path breaking. Okay, and given the energy levels, and if you set up a mechanism where successive participants of these organizations are recipients of a tradition of knowledge and recipients of a tradition of discourse and recipients of a tradition of outreach and interaction with the rest of the society, I think that would be a stellar starting point. That's my only message. I have nothing more to say.
Yeah, thank you so much for all your thoughts. I think this has been a very sort of fruitful discussion. We've touched upon a lot of different topics, but I think at the same time, they've all been very much related to each other. So I would thank you so much for your time, and I think thank you for
Welcome.
Thank you, Saiji, for sharing your wealth of knowledge regarding this important topic, and also for joining so early in the morning all the way from India. And thank you, Chetanji, for moderating this webinar. If you're interested in hearing more about Saiji's endeavors, please be sure to follow his social media pages or take a look at his lectures online. We hope you all enjoyed learning a little bit more about decoloniality and the human global rights movement. Moving on, we would like to quickly present our topic for next week, which is Epics Through the Ages, a modern rendition of Hindu storytelling. Our speaker is the well-known fusion author and Indian diplomat Amish Tripathi. Amish is best known for his trilogy, The Immortals of Meluha. Join us next week for our 7th webinar to hear his unique take on the impact of Hindu storytelling in today's generation. And please be sure to follow Northeast Hindu Yuva pages on Instagram and Facebook, and subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can watch all of our webinars, the previous ones, the future ones, and tonight's. Thank you all for joining. Shubhratri and Namaste.